Welcome to the League of American Orchestras Wednesday webinar. My name is David Stiers. I'm the Director of Learning and Leadership Programs at the League. And I want to thank you for joining us today for part 2 of our series on fundraising in this time of crisis. Part 1 was last Wednesday and is now available on demand at our website, americanorchestras.org. And we know this is a stressful time for everyone. And again, we really appreciate your taking the time to join us today. I also want to express our thanks to generous funders who have made these webinars possible, including American Express, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as support in part by the public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Also, everyone who is attending and registered for today's webinar will receive an email with the recording soon, along with a survey for your feedback. In addition to the PowerPoint deck, which you should have also received in advance with the reminder email about the webinar. We are thrilled to have approaching over 300 participants with us today, and it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our returning presenters from last week, Bob Swaney and James Leffler. Bob is founder and CEO of Robert Swaney Consulting, and he has a 30-year career in arts fundraising and has worked with over 100 organizations across the country to strengthen their philanthropic core. And he has served on the development staffs of the Chicago, Evansville, Indianapolis, and St. Louis Symphony Orchestras. And as of last week, Bob was the new interim Vice President of Development here at the League. And we are also pleased to have with us James Leffler, the Vice President of Development of the Dallas Symphony Orchestra since 2016. And he has broad experience in nonprofit development, having worked in a variety of areas, including youth services, higher education, healthcare, and the performing arts. And additionally, James was a partner in a consulting firm that provided fundraising and digital solutions for community colleges. So please feel free to ask questions at any time in the Q&A box, but after Bob and James give an opening presentation, we'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end. And again, I once again want to thank Bob and James for their participation in this webinar today, and I'll turn it over to both of them. Thank you so much.
David, thank you. This is Bob Swaney. Thanks again. Thanks to the League. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts and ideas and share some best practices that we've heard out in the field in our conversations these last few weeks. And so we'll do a little revisit of last week, and then we'll get into some new material this week. And as you said, David, we'll leave plenty of room for Q&A. A little bit about our company. Those of you who aren't familiar with us, my firm works exclusively with arts and cultural institutions, almost all in performing arts, and very heavily with symphony orchestras. So one of our longtime clients has been the Dallas Symphony, and so very natural to request that James be part of this presentation. You've got a depth of experience, and I'll let him tell you just a little bit about it.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and thank you, David, and all of our friends at the League. Happy to have this opportunity again. We've worked with Bob's firm for a little over 4 years now, and a lot of what we discussed on the webinar last week and we'll discuss today are things that we've worked together at the Dallas Symphony to great effect. It's been a great relationship, and appreciate the chance to present today with Bob.
Thanks so much. All right, next slide, please. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll do a recap of last week. As I mentioned, we'll talk about the description of the donor cycle that we use and how it's adapted during the pandemic, and how relationships can be strengthened over the next 18 months. I think that's maybe the largest horizon that anyone's looking at presently, but we're willing to look farther if you want to. And fundraising options going into the 2021 season, and then we'll do our general question and answer session. So if, as we're touching on something particularly, if you have a question about it, go ahead and send that in and we'll address it towards the end of the webinar. Great, next slide. And as a reminder, I don't think it's on anyone's mind now, but if it is, the League still has the on-demand availability of this to talk about the CARES Act, the loan processing, that sort of thing. So that information from the first 2 weeks of webinars is also available. All right, thank you. Next slide. So the recap, for those of you, I'll give you a little detail for anyone who wasn't on last week, but here were the top things that we talked about. We said we'd focus on what you can control and what you can influence. That in an environment like this, we want to try to control everything, including fundraising, including other parts of the organization. But right now, it's very, very difficult to begin to articulate solutions for things where you can't articulate what the problem is or where you think things are going. So we're saying there are, and included in fundraising, a set number of variables that you can look at and know that you can either control or influence those. And particularly in fundraising, that's where we ask you to focus moving forward. We talked about keeping the money, and that's in terms of keeping both contributed revenue and keeping earned revenue in the current fiscal year whenever possible. And what that means is if you're canceling concerts or are fairly certain that you're canceling concerts, the moment that you do that, we've been suggesting, rather than giving refunds or rather than trying to bank that money into future seasons, since you don't know exactly when you'll be performing again, to instead convert that money as much as possible into annual fund gifts. I had a couple of questions in my personal inbox after last week's session. I was asked, what do we see as normal conversion rates? I can tell you normal conversion rates from ticket revenue into annual fund revenue for canceled performances has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 65% is normal. We've had some cases where it's been in excess of 90%, and we were even surprised by that, but it speaks directly to the generosity of patrons and their love for your institutions. And so if you're not doing those things, we suggest that you start doing them, because it translates into real cash for you that's kept now with very little risk that people will not buy again when you're back performing. We talked about creating value, producing and promoting music. Whatever you can produce, if it's music, if it's by voice that you're announcing things, if it's discussions, if it's forums, whatever those look like, continue to put those out. Create value and promote the music and the products that you have, the services that you're providing. We talked about engaging musicians in the board. That'll be a constant theme, board and musicians both. That'll be a constant theme throughout our discussion today, so I won't spend a lot of time on it here. We understand that different organizations have different setups with their musicians and even with their board, and so we'll provide what we believe to be our best case scenarios, best practice scenarios that you can adopt depending on your size orchestra and the resources that you have and the relationships that you have between management, governance, and musicians. Keep asking and stewarding. Again, I got a little bit of feedback on this afterwards about board members particularly who say we shouldn't be asking for money. My response back to them was, if you're not selling tickets and you're not asking for money, you are really limiting your ability to have revenue come into your organization. So we take it as a given to keep asking for support and to keep stewarding relationships. And again, we'll talk about those in depth throughout this presentation. And then prepare for more fundraising in 2021 season, what that might look like if you have a suspended performance schedule for an extended period of time. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of this presentation today as well. Next slide, please. So the 6 actions that we talked about that your orchestra can take immediately to raise more money. These will sound very familiar. Many of them were on the previous slide. Create and post content as much as you can. Constantly promote. Stay top of mind for your patrons and your donors. Double down on stewardship. And not every piece of stewardship has to be about what your organization's doing right now. Sometimes stewardship is just reaching out to touch base with your investors and to make sure that they're okay, to make sure that they understand and can access the information and the music that you're putting out there, and just, add value to their lives as well. Asking for support, we just talked about. Engaging your musicians and the board, we just talked about. And consider engaging a guide. We also mentioned last week in terms of either getting a local professional or getting a consultant like my firm, for just efficiency and effectiveness sake. You can't afford to waste time. You can't afford to make mistakes right now in this environment. And you have enough other variables that you have to be creative on. This doesn't necessarily have to be one of them starting from scratch. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move into some new material. This is the next section talking about the donor cycle. Many of you will be familiar with this or something that looks like this, but usually in a fundraising cycle, and you look at a donor or a prospect, there's a way to identify them. There's a way to then cultivate them. Then we solicit them. Then we steward or appreciate them. And then we later talk about, is there anything else that we want to move them toward in terms of how they give, what they give to, that sort of thing. So there is some subtle differences in between having current donors increase their giving and having new donors come to the table. And particularly now where most of the music is, live music's being suspended and trying to get new audiences to turn into new donors. That's a little bit tougher right now, but we are going to address that as well. And so when we look at this cycle, we know that not every cultivation leads to an immediate ask. Not every appreciation or stewardship step leads to an immediate upgrade request for a larger gift. And that's okay. These are all very important steps, and we'll go through them in just a moment as well. But while solicitation is important, it actually takes the least amount of time in this cycle. I should probably just make that box a little smaller. The cultivation and the appreciation particularly are the places where you need to continue to invest your time. And the solicitation, while ultimately important, has to be supported by approaching a donor, building a relationship with a donor, and then after they've given, showing appreciation, stewarding, and deepening the relationship even more. All right,
So Bob, a question's come up, which I think is probably on a lot of people's mind, and you already alluded to it, where their board's fundraising committee doesn't think now is the time to be asking people for money. They plan to contact donors and check on them, but don't want to send anything out with an ask. And even though the staff has urged them to rethink that decision, they've confirmed that now is not the time. And so the concern is now ending the season with half the budgeted amount raised. Any helpful advice, particularly for those volunteer board members of our orchestras?
Sure, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is follow the trends. And the trends right now are that looking at other organizations who are actually doing this are doing it quite successfully. So that's first and foremost. Those organizations who continue to ask for philanthropic support are getting it and are getting it unapologetically and without a lot of strings attached. Most donors, particularly those who are volunteer premier categories, are the same folks who understand that while their market share might be down, while their portfolio might be down, that continuing to support the symphony at this point might bruise them a little bit, but it's certainly not going to break them. And they know how much the symphony needs it and the value of the symphony. So that's number one. And number two, I mean, just on a more practical level, I would say if you're unable to sell tickets and you're choosing not to ask for money, what's left? As an institution, I can't understand the pathway to success on that. So that's number two. Number three would be with your donors particularly, show some flexibility. So some new rules, and we're going to talk about those new rules in a few minutes, but I'll give you one hint, for instance. Be a little flexible with maybe when they give or the frequency in which they pay their pledge. It may not be a $5,000 gift all at once. It might be $2,500. It might be $1,000 a month until they reach, and then $500 until they reach that threshold. It might be that they're waiting for a stock to come back up a little bit until it bounces. They won't make that stock transaction. So showing a lot of flexibility will be key and necessary in continuing to approach donors.
Great, thank you, Bob.
So the critical to the cycle, especially now, on the next slide, we'll talk the consistent attention and focus to each step. So in contrast to what I just said, asking for money is not the only important thing to do in fundraising right now. I think most of you know that, but handling the relationships in a time where the frequency at which your patrons see you has dramatically decreased. Again, very important to be very forward thinking in terms of outreach to those folks. Keep and to continue to identify new donors as well, new money from current donors. So you still have single ticket buyers. Some of them converted their tickets into fundraising if you've gone through that step. And now you have a pool of folks who, as you go into the 2021 season, might actually qualify to some degree being recurring donors. They certainly won't all do it, but it is a prospect pool from which you can look at. So the outward focus, again, this is one of our mantras when everything feels semi-normal. But we say it's an outward focus. Focus less on what you need, focus more on the value that you add, and look to engage donors and prospects in that part of the story, in the value that you add. This is a constant always, but it's especially important now to help donors and patrons and funders feel connected. Communication plan, it's an institutional wide, it's not just a fundraising plan. It is an institutional wide, outward thinking, value-based, not just what you do, but why you do it, who you do it for, what's the value in that, why it's important. That idea that you can build that story, and even if you're not on stage, on time, on schedule this year, you can still begin and continue to discuss the kind of organization that you are, the value that you add, who you affect, and why you're worthy of continued investment, even in a time like this. Mutually beneficial relationships. So again, this is not one that we would say think one way. It's not about us reaching out to people and asking them for money solely. This again is about making sure that if you are putting music on YouTube or doing Facebook Live or doing any sort of watch parties like that, that your investors know that it's available and that you're encouraging them as much as possible to partake in those. It's the way to stay connected to the art form. The emphasis on cultivation and stewardship I mentioned a moment ago, they're very, very similar. The activities are very, very similar. They're just different people sometimes. So with the cultivation, that's usually a new donor or a donor who you're going to ask for a significant increase. The stewarding are people who are already giving to you and just continue to need information and to feel the value of the relationship going back and forth. And customizing gift requests, this is a little bit about what I spoke of just a few minutes ago, but the methodology is also very important. More phone calls, particularly now, fewer letters, being flexible, working to accommodate their situations because their situations are different too. So it does take some creative thinking as you move forward. But if you've built good relationships with your donors already, you'll know a lot about them. You'll know how to be flexible. You'll know in some ways how to approach them and have that starting conversation. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the different divisions that would be in the fundraising. James is going to take this one and we'll start talking about board, then individuals, and sort of down the line. So let me hand that off to James and take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. And for those of you who are following along on a phone and don't have a computer in front of you, but you've got the slide deck, this is slide 10, the board giving, cultivation, and stewardship slide. So let me first go back to the question that was asked about what if your board does not support asking right now. I would say that it goes without saying a top priority then is working with your board and showing them the value of continuing your philanthropic pursuits right now and how important that is not only to get through the pandemic, but also come out the other side as strong as you can. And I'm going to jump ahead. One additional thing I'd add to Bob's response, which I thought was great, is as always, it's really important that we never make a decision for a donor by just not asking them because we've decided that all other factors being equal, we don't think they might say yes. So let's leave it to the donors to make that decision and let's give them the opportunity to make the decision. And if you'd like more ideas or strategy or thoughts on how you can work with your board to get them to change course, I know Bob and I would both be happy to spend time with you on that. But let's assume for a moment that you have a board that is open and supportive of continuing your philanthropy. So your fundraising programs. making it personal, we've started here at the Dallas Symphony with the approach of remembering that every single one of our board members is being uniquely impacted by the pandemic. And just like our donors, that doesn't just mean the degree to which they're financially impacted, but independent of that, it could be their emotional impact and their confidence in any number of things, including their giving, the future of this organization, and the other organizations. So we try to approach each conversation with that awareness in mind. And then again, first and foremost, we just stay in touch with them as much as possible. By now, each of our board members has received multiple phone calls from our CEO and from me, emails. We continue to acknowledge birthdays, anniversary celebrations. If there's some sort of sad event that takes place, of course, we acknowledge that appropriately. So we continue that level of engagement, and we've stepped it up even further to keep them fully informed of what's going on, and also to let them know we recognize they too are humans being impacted by this, and we care about them. The other thing that, and I mentioned this last week, is we're continuing the business of the board. Obviously, we have to put new plans in place and do scenario planning and respond to the challenge of the pandemic, but we also want to keep planning and working towards the future. So we're doing a lot of that, and importantly, we're soliciting their feedback and their ideas on how to do that and keeping them engaged in the process of governing the organization. And we're also keeping in mind, and this is something I'd like to encourage everybody out there to remember, especially for your board members who are retired, now that they don't have the ability to get out and about, what we're discovering is many of our board members are looking for something to fill their time. So any way you can help them meaningfully be engaged, whether it's in their governance work or planning for a future event or reimagining a future event, if you don't think you'll be able to execute it as you had originally imagined. Another idea is start documenting your board members' stories. If you haven't done this, call and spend an hour on the phone and ask them about their entire engagement with your organization, why that's meaningful, and collect that information. It'll be invaluable to you in many ways, and most importantly, it'll make them remember why this institution or why your institution is so important to them. And then another obvious, but I think very important one, and I mentioned this last week, we've worked really hard to try to provide opportunities for our board members to stay connected with our musicians where they're interested. So in our case, we offered Zoom chats, whether it's over coffee or lunch or a cocktail with a musician and either our CEO or myself, and a variety of other ways that we've kept our musicians and our board members in touch with one another has been really good for morale overall. And of course, remembering to thank our board members. And the one last thing I'd say is, and we hit on this last week, that at the Dallas Symphony, the approach we're taking is asking with confidence, and that confidence will translate over to our board. And one of their jobs is to be ambassadors for our institution in the community. And if we can project that confidence to them, and it doesn't mean burying our head in the sand and not acknowledging the reality of challenges, but that we're still forward looking and we're doing everything we possibly can to be prepared to weather the storm. That will translate to how they project confidence in the community, and that will have deep and lasting impacts on current and future philanthropy. So next slide, please. This is slide number 11 that we're moving to. So when it comes for actually asking, again, I would say following Wayne Gretzky's advice, it's we miss 100% of the shots we don't take. It's very important that we continue to ask people to support our organization, and there's an appropriate way to do that, of course, and framing it in a way that we acknowledge the challenge and the uncertainty of the times. But to continue to talk to people and ask for them to engage philanthropically with the organization is very important. And one thing that I would point out and highlight is, and this has been a learning lesson to me, so we have a rather large board. We have over 80 members of our board of governors, and then an executive committee that actually has fiduciary responsibility. And among those, we've had a small number of people who for many years have done the minimum level of giving. And of course, we're grateful for that. But anytime an additional opportunity might come up, there's a group that has historically declined to participate. And I was tempted, I shared the story last week about the group letter that we sent out asking board members to increase their support this year and commit to next year and make those payments early. I was hesitant to send that to a certain number of the people who had always done the sort of minimum level of giving requirements, thinking they're not going to increase. Well, following the good advice of one of our executive board members, we sent it to them anyway, and I was pleasantly surprised. Several of them actually did end up responding to that. So the lesson learned for me, and I think for many of us, is twofold. One, again, not making decisions for people ahead of time, but also unique situations like this tend to create new perspectives and new opportunities for us and for board members. So as we're talking to board members about their philanthropy and about their role more broadly in the organization, I think this is a great time for us to think in new ways about how they can make a difference and support us. As I mentioned, we're talking to most of our board members about the possibility of making early commitments for the upcoming fiscal year. And of course, we're having to be flexible, as Bob has mentioned, in terms of how some of that will be paid out. But by and large, our board is committed to that. And I'll talk in a minute how we imagine that will sort of trickle down to our other giving levels as well. And the other thing is, for us, the way we're looking at this, now more than ever, it's important for us to leverage peer-to-peer volunteer fundraising through our board where they're comfortable. So we're being very thoughtful and spending a lot of time talking to our board and equipping them with the right kind of messaging and confidence and knowledge to talk to their friends on the board and in the community who have long time supported the organization, and asking them to step up and join them. And the message is very simple. This is very important to me. It's very important to our community. And here's all the reasons this is going to make a difference. And I'm asking you to join me in doing this.
James, a question in that solicitation is, do you have any advice on what to ask for? So for example, say a youth orchestra historically would have asked for specific things like an instrument or a scholarship. What are your thoughts now? Is it just to make a very broad request, like where it's most needed? Any way you see the current crisis changing how we're making that solicitation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I would group that into two groups for broader based asks. I would say inventory the priority and the needs of your organization, and try to do so in a way that still provides for your basic operational needs. In other words, I would not advocate, especially right now, doing a bunch of fundraising for things that are incrementally additive to your budget, but conversely, that are budget relieving. So inventory and prioritize those. And I would say build your messaging around those things, whatever it is. So in our case, we're continuing our education programs online, and that creates some opportunities for us to continue to support some pretty significant expenses we have related to that are in our operating budget. And it's a very compelling message for donors. So we're tending to wrap a lot of our messaging and solicitations and stewardship in that. For, and this actually jumps ahead a little bit, but that's great. For your more premier donors, or where you want to make a more significant ask, or it's a board member, or you want to make it more exclusive for them, I would still say look at your inventory of needs and priority, but then develop a very customized case for that person or couple with whom you're working. And make sure that matches what you know to be their interests and their needs and how they want to make a difference for the institution.
And James, let me throw one other thought in there. So if you're in an orchestra right now that is a sometimes either smaller budget or limited on what you can provide right now, I would say shoot for a single point of light and communicate that. And usually right now, that single point of light is, our mission is to get music back on stage, live music back on stage as soon as we can. And to do that, we're working as hard as we can to keep the organization whole, to keep it moving forward, and driving towards that point when we can put live music back on stage. So what I'm not emphasizing on is, we need it for operational support, because that is not a particularly attractive case statement in and of itself. But to support operations, to drive towards something much larger, like getting the music back, can be very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Great. And then follow up to that issue of the what, who should be making the ask? So should the ask from the board come from the CEO or president, or from the staff officer who may have been managing the relationship in the past?
I'll give first the very unsatisfying answer that I think that depends, but to give a more specific answer, when it comes to the board, especially if you have a board with an executive committee structure, we tend to default to having the CEO at least influence the conversation, if not be the one to make the ask. That's not to say that I, as the Vice President of Development, don't have some of those conversations, but in a time like this, I would say it's very important to lead with leadership. And if your CEO who's not comfortable with fundraising, or you have a CEO who's not comfortable with that, I would partner them with either a board member or a staff person in your development department who can equip them to be part of those conversations now. I think for your board leadership and your leadership donors in general, I think now more than ever, it's important for them to feel like they're connected with the leadership of the organization. What do you think, Bob?
I agree with everything you're saying. At a more rudimentary level, I would say the person who should be asking is the person who's most likely to get an affirmative response. And sometimes that's a board member, and sometimes it's a staff member, and sometimes it might be a combination. So there's really no wrong answer there, as long as you say, what's our best chance of having that person respond the way we want them to, and who would they need to talk to help guide them in that direction.
Great. And one more follow-up question. What's your feelings about matching gifts? Either getting a high-level donor or another board member to put up a matching gift to help spearhead an appeal?
Hey, let's wait till we get to the broad base, because I think we actually addressed that.
Okay, great.
But we won't forget. I promise you, I will not forget about matching gifts.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. Let's go to the next slide, please. Slide number 12. So much of the approach we talked about with the board applies here as well, and the principles are largely the same. The one thing I would add is I think the goal is to make this group of donors who, at least in our case, and I'd imagine that's the case for many of you, a lot of this group are board members as well, but for those who aren't, the goal is to make them feel like an insider with the organization. So there's a couple of things that we do to help facilitate that. One, we try to share news and information with them ahead of the general public. So if we're going to do a press release, we might actually send an embargoed copy to them the day before, or it could even just be the morning before it goes out that afternoon. So they feel like they have an insider's look. We try to make sure they have updates coming consistently and regularly when there's something important to share from our CEO to them. And now that can be we can add them to a board update email that we send, or it can be personalized, whatever the case may be. But making them feel like they have direct access to leadership and decision-making is something that we try to do at the Dallas Symphony, and has had a good benefit on our relationships. And then the other thing I would say is be proactive about seeking out their advice. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to take all of it, especially if it doesn't fit, but making them, Bob used the word investors a minute ago, making them feel like as investors in the organization, they have a voice and some influence. And one of the questions that we like to ask is, what are you seeing from other organizations with which you're involved that you think we at our Orchestra could learn from? And again, that doesn't mean you have to take the advice, but projecting that you are genuinely interested in their expertise and counsel will certainly facilitate the relationship in the way that you want. And then something else that is very important to remember, and we try to stay focused on at the Dallas Symphony, especially at a time like this where we're so focused on how do we get through this and make the most of a very challenging situation, is that it has to not be about us, but it needs to be about the donor, the individual, the family, the decision maker at the foundation, whatever that is. So starting with questions and conversations like, how are you doing? How is your family doing? Where is everybody? Are they safe? Things like that. And starting with the genuine human interest in them and their lives. And then finding out through open-ended questions, how is this pandemic impacting your life on the whole? This isn't, for me, this isn't so much about the details of, well, here's my financial situation, my business has been hit in this way. It's just, what's their mental and emotional state in response to that? And it will also give you clues about how they might want to be involved in helping your orchestra get through this time. And then, so that leads to another thing that I think is important, that is donor facing rather than us facing. And that's to ask them what their concerns are about how the pandemic might impact the orchestra. And again, it's basically asking them, how would you like to make a difference for us? And then you can, from there, know how best to craft your approach to asking them to support you during this time. And then, just like the board, making sure that they have opportunities to interact with your musicians, board members, if that's meaningful to them, other donors through small engagement. If you're doing any sort of online activities that make sense for them, be sure to continue to feed that information to them. And again, think differently about it. You may have a group of very high-level donors that you have not engaged in certain broad-based communications, that it may make sense to revisit that now so that they're getting all of the content you're sharing. Next slide, please.
One question, if you want to answer it now, again, back to the who. And the previous two slides, we talked about board members as donors. How are we engaging board members as part of our sort of fundraising team? So what's your opinion or guidance on board members personally reaching out to donors with a phone call to check in with them and thank them for continuing to support?
I think Bob said it perfectly. Whoever the right person is to likely get the best possible result, if that's a board member, then I absolutely advocate for doing that. In fact, just before we are on this call, I had a phone call with our past board chair, asking him to follow up with a couple of people who we had sent a solicitation letter to just last week, and talking through those dynamics. And he agreed to call one of the three people I asked him to call, and he had valid reasons for not wanting to connect with the other two. So we'll move on to somebody else for those.
Yeah.
Great. And go ahead, Bob.
I would only add that when preparing, I think it's a great idea. We're really pro in having board members reach out to donors, because they also share the donor room. They sit in the similar seating section. I mean, there's relationship there of and above just the governance portion. What I would say, though, is, first of all, we try to equip board members with one or two pieces of information to share if it's appropriate. And we also help instruct them then that they don't have to know everything. If someone asks a question that they don't know the answer to, there are plenty of people who do, and so follow-up back to the staff is very important, not just to deliver news, but to also get questions answered that came up during a phone call. So if you just think about that board member as the conduit to information and relationship, that preparing them becomes really clear. They don't have to be over-prepared. It shouldn't be over-prepared, but have enough to talk about, and then have enough to ask and bring back some information.
Great. And I just also wanted to share thank you, John, for writing in that the Newport Symphony Orchestra, the Ocean, that you're having your board call 110 volunteers just to thank them. And so that's just 10 calls for each board member in order to keep them very involved in talking with those who value the orchestra most, checking up on how they are doing, and thanking them. And the symphony is hopeful that this will give purpose to the board members and then keep the lines of communications open with those very valuable volunteers. So I, again, think it's a great way to think about what are roles that the board can be taking on that really helps you now as extension of your human resource capacity.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What a great activity. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's wonderful. And you're probably doing this, but if you're not, I would absolutely advocate for make sure to follow up with the board members and ask them to take notes on the conversation so you can document some of that for future reference. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next slide. This is 13. So for our premier individuals, when it comes to actually asking them, And Bob talked through this later, so I won't belabor the point of being thoughtful and flexible. But last week we talked through some options of how gifts can be structured. In this case, I really think it's about us meeting the donors where they are in terms of the actual structure of the gift. And there's a lot of ways that can play out. I will say for us, we're seeing a number of our donors, especially at the higher levels, who have given via one means or one path for a lot of years. Suddenly they're doing it through 2 or 3 other paths. And Bob also alluded to this, but obviously we're not seeing a lot of donors transfer stock right now for obvious reasons. But we're seeing a lot more people give through, rely heavily on donor advised funds, or just send checks in and that sort of a thing. And we're also having a lot of conversations with donors about the timing of their gift. So we get a lot of questions like, yes, I would like to do what you've asked me to do, and can I pay it here rather than here? And the obvious answer, of course, is yes, and thank you so much. Again, go into each conversation realizing that, just like I mentioned with board members, every donor is impacted differently, and it's not just financially, it could be emotionally and their confidence. So if you go in with that open-mindedness, it'll help you navigate the conversation and help, as you're working with them, produce a result that's exciting for them and important for the organization as well. And I would say for us, when it's appropriate and when possible, we're asking our donors to go ahead and make next year's commitment now, and we're asking them to consider doing that with an increase. And I'd say about a quarter of our donors that we've asked to do that at the higher levels are agreeing to do that, which we're actually pretty pleased with those results. So the point is, we're still asking, and we're doing so with confidence, and yet we recognize not all of our donors, in fact, many are not going to be in a position to feel comfortable making either an early commitment or an increased commitment or both. And then it's just a matter of listening to what their response is and crafting a structure that works for them from there. And then one thing that I think is really going to make a difference, we're starting to use this now, that I would encourage you to do, and this came up just a minute ago, is the idea of tying their gift to something specific in the operating budget that you know is meaningful for them. So it could be any number of things. And as Bob said, it doesn't mean we're necessarily asking, please give a gift to support the operating budget, but it's, your contribution at this level will allow us to continue this, whatever it is that's very important to you and to our organization. So with the Dallas Symphony, and I know I've talked about this several times, but it's something that's worked for us to great effect. We had launched a new education program in a part of our community that's largely an arts desert and has very little access for elementary age school students to music education. So we launched an El Sistema style program that's free instruments and free lessons for what was about 550 children in the community. So far, we've been able to convert about 150 of those students, excuse me, to online lessons with our teaching artists. So they're getting 5 days a week now, 1 to 2 hours a day of some kind of online music education. And in many cases, that's really the only quality educational content that they're getting, because that part of our school district has been challenged to provide education otherwise. In addition to that, we're delivering all of the technology they need, literally delivering it to their homes. And for students and families that need it, we're also working to provide food for them. So it's a holistic program that's very meaningful for our donors. So we've been asking donors to step up and help support that. And that, because of the way our budget is structured, has allowed us to also provide for some operational needs that supports that. So that's an example of how we're tying some of the asks to things that we know are important to our donors. And it's not really about us, it's about what that donor cares about in the community. Next slide, please.
Oh, just a few questions. Do you think donors are expecting to hear news on adjustment plans or recovery plans or budget changes, and to hear how the organization is changing the way music is delivered? and programming changes to be more relevant to these changes times. How much information do you need to be giving of sort of how you're making any lemonade out of these lemons? What's the balance of detail?
Sure. I'd love Bob to respond to this as well. For us, I would say the greater the investment, the greater the level of detail that we're sharing with the donor. And our goal is to be as transparent as we reasonably can. And this goes back to, so for us, a donor who maybe is looking at a $100,000 gift this year to help us through this time, it's going to be a very personalized conversation where an executive board member or our CEO or myself or some conversation are in it. And they'll basically have an open forum to ask us any question they want, and we'll be as responsive as we can to that. Getting to our more broad base, what we want to do is focus on what we're doing in the short term to continue providing music and music education where we can, and what our plans are moving forward for the future. So I think Bob said it very well last week when he said, we don't want to bury our head in the sand and act like there's nothing going on, because that's obviously not the case. So we want to be upfront, but we want to keep it all couched in a very positive, here's the reality of, here's a challenge. Now here's 2 good things we're also doing to move that all forward. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, no, that's precisely what I would say is looking, it's not that you can't be the deliverer of bad news, but if that's where you stop, it'll really shrink the confidence level, which then will shrink the ability to give and support you. So as much encouraging as you can do, as much as you can display that you've put thought into how you're moving forward, even if that changes some, what you're aiming for in terms of getting music back on stage, what you're aiming for in terms of community engagement. That's the inspiration that I think is needed, particularly now.
Great. I also have some questions about sponsors and sponsorship. I don't know whether you want to answer those now or hold those or wait a little bit later.
Let's hold those, because we'll get to that in just a couple of minutes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Yep, certainly. Thank you. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, and I'll move a little bit more quickly here so we have plenty of time for questions, and acknowledging that the Dallas Symphony is of a size that, we have some resources I recognize a number of people on this call may not have. So I'll try to be general and give some ideas that can be applied to an organization regardless of budget size and resource. But one thing I would say is don't stop asking, and continue using the methods that you currently have. So if that's telefund, if it's direct mail, if it's a direct solicitation, whether that be from a staff member, a board member, or some other volunteer, continue to make it easy for donors to give. Last week we talked about having options on your website. If you're still in the subscription campaign, making sure that there are ticket add-on options. Whatever that is, the point here is we want to continue to provide those opportunities. And I will say at the Dallas Symphony, we continue to see very encouraging results from all of our broad-based channels. So until we see otherwise, we'll continue to send that to leverage those opportunities. So whatever makes sense for your organization, I think the important thing is to focus on things that are high leverage and high return, especially if right now your resources, especially staff time, is stretched or limited in any way. Really lean into the things that have the greatest impact. So at the Dallas Symphony, for instance, for the last several years, I think like a lot of organizations, we've been playing with text to give and social campaign options. Those have their role for us, but they're by no means primary sources for driving contributions. So while we're not going to stop those altogether, we're definitely leaning away from those, and we won't be pursuing a whole lot of new sort of exploratory activity with those for the foreseeable future. We're going to continue to try to execute very well on our telefund. We're going to continue to refine our direct mail messaging, and spend as much of our staff time as we can personally calling our broad base so that we stay connected with them. And that's where I think we're going to lean most heavily into our high leverage, high return opportunities. And I would say if you find that you've got the capacity, that's one area I would highly encourage is if you can have staff or board or volunteers calling and reaching further down into donor segments at your lower giving levels than you might normally. I think there's a lot of benefit. And right now we've got a little extra time for that because our staff isn't also busy executing a whole lot of concerts and benefit activities around those. So for us, it's going to give us a better understanding of who our donors are. And in some cases, it will yield surprise increases. For instance, just earlier this week, we called a donor who I believe was giving $1,000 a year, certainly a generous gift. And they increased to $3,000 as a result of one of my colleagues calling and having a conversation with them. So that's an area I would very much encourage people to lean into if you've got that bandwidth. And then finally, think creatively, utilizing challenge grants. I know that came up. We very much believe in that, matching grants for broad base. We talked last week, if there's a giving day happening in your area and you have the resources to be able to put the basic infrastructure together, it certainly helps to have one more channel for giving. And then involving your musicians in any way you can. So a couple of things we've done, we've asked some of our musicians to create birthday videos, happy birthday videos. So they'll play happy birthday on their instrument and send a little message, and we send that out to our donors that we know when their birthday is, and the same with thank you videos. So we just received 4 or 5 videos that we sort of loosely scripted for our musicians, just saying thank you. One of our viola players had her young daughter in her lap who was part of the thank you. It's the cutest thing you've ever seen. So we'll be sending those out along with our donor acknowledgements as well. And it's a way of keeping people engaged after they've made the gift. So if there are no questions about.
There's several questions. So okay. What did your colleagues say to the donor to make the jump from 1,000 to 3,000?
Oh, I wish I knew. I have not had a chance to talk to her about that, but she may be on the call. If by chance, Jamie, you hear this, send me a text for the brief outline and maybe we can revisit it in a moment, what she said.
Okay.
I apologize. I don't know. We haven't had a chance to connect about the details.
Jamie is on the call. So we'll figure that out. So while we figure that out, another question, when you're talking about broad-based fundraising, are you including subscribers who are non-donors in your solicitation? And the concern is that will it take away from their potential ticket purchases in the future if you solicit money from them?
Oh, sure. This is Bob.
Yeah.
Yes, it does include what we commonly call subscriber non-donors. And I get this question occasionally, and while I understand it, I can tell you that in my career, which is almost 35 years now, I have never seen, not a single time, never seen someone who gives a donation decide not to make a purchase for something that they really, really want to go see. And that includes subscribership. I've seen the opposite happen on occasion, but consumers want to consume, and that includes classical music. So we see that as a pretty safe zone. The timing is important to not overburden the patron with too much too soon, too repeatedly. But by and large, that it is fine to go ask subscriber non-donors to make a contribution. And ultimately, your conversion rate on that should be somewhere in the neighborhood of probably, depending on your subscriber base, 40 to 55% would be a safe zone.
Okay, that's great. So if an orchestra is locked out of their building and they're not able to send formal acknowledgments as they normally do, and they're sending those to people that they have emails for and making phone calls to donors who lack emails, Is there anything else you would suggest doing in the absence of being able to send a written acknowledgement right now?
So we actually, we have access to our building, and we've planned to move as much of that to a digital format as possible, whether it's an acknowledgement or a tax receipt or whatever it is. Or also equally important, what's what I'm looking for, gift invoices or contribution invoices. We've moved all of that to online unless we know there's a donor or an institution where we have to communicate by mail. So it took just a little bit of retooling, but I think the majority of that you can do remotely, assuming you have access to your database and your accounting system online. And so far it's been effective. And what we've done is just have our fundraising team, each individual fundraiser, be the person responsible for sending the acknowledgement or the receipt or the gift reminder from their inbox with a personalized email. And it does take a little bit of extra time, but that's how we've approached doing it. I think there's any number of ways you could. If I would say if you can't send something electronically or something needs to go via US mail and you don't have that ability, I would just start by contacting the donor or the institution, explaining the situation and working with them on finding some other means for getting them the information that they need. And I find it difficult to believe right now that most places and people wouldn't be willing to work with you.
True. Yeah, that and what I would add is if you can also on your website notate that on the giving page and just say there might be a delay in getting your very generous, your receipt for your very generous gift. And also if you're doing any sort of outward communication, written communication to your patron base, you could include that as a line, just because it communicates it, B, it sets a certain expectation, and C, it doesn't leave a void of communication that we don't want them to fill in on their own.
And then another question, particularly for orchestras who haven't been used to dealing with returned tickets as donations, how are you counting them and recognizing them as one, an annual fund donation with membership benefits, or is this a different type of donation? So in that receipt, what are you saying that return ticket is, or what do you recommend coding that as?
So I'll be honest and say I'm not happy right now with where we're at with our process for that. We actually just revamped it, and acknowledging ticket donations was something that happened outside of the development department. So we just, as a result of this and the sudden high volume of ticket donations, transition that to our development department. And so what we're doing right in this moment, and I'm not saying this is the model, because I think there's a better way to do it, but we're sending a one-off ticket donation acknowledgement as a tax-deductible gift to the donor. And we do that on a weekly, just every week we'll sort of batch the latest group of ticket donations and send those individualized. We have not gotten into the conversation with any of our donors about translating that to annual fund gifts. It really hasn't been an impediment for us. In other words, we haven't needed to sort of encourage ticket or patrons to donate the tickets, but it's a missed opportunity, I think, for us in the long run, and there's a better way for us to manage that.
So I've seen a variety of different approaches, and the commonality is that most do treat it like a legitimate annual fund gift. Many track it separately so that when renewal time, fundraising renewal time comes around, that one-off gift can be extracted. Probably the exception I've seen is that if this is a first-time gift because of the ticket conversion, there's consideration in play. Do we ask them to renew on that amount? And in most cases, I think we'll ask them to do that. In many cases, we're combining gifts. So if someone's made a gift and this is a secondary gift, we've seen those combined to err on the side of being generous to the donor. So when benefits are back in play and that are associated with performances and recognition and all that we're really doubling down to thank them. So in most cases, it like that, it falls to how can we help accommodate the donor to the best of our ability, since they did something really exceptional for us right now.
Great. And one more question about messaging the ask. So if your orchestra was fortunate enough to secure a payroll protection program fund from an SBA loan and are able to pay the staff and musicians, does that affect the ask that you're making? And if so, how?
This is James. I would simply say no, it does not. At least so far, we haven't encountered a scenario where it affects it either way. I mean, other than for our board members who are in the know of where we're at with that process, I think it gives them encouragement that we have the additional resource. So it's a positive motivator. But otherwise, we don't make that part of our conversations.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And if you do decide to make it part of the conversation, I mean, I think you pose it in the way that it is. It's good news. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we talk about, can you, for every you know, bad new piece of news you have, can you couch 2 good pieces of news to help continue to build confidence? That can be a really good piece, as long as it's part of a tapestry of messaging that says, but here's why we're continuing to ask for support. Here's what we're looking towards the future at. And so if it's the main point, it would probably be a detriment. If it's one point among many and used correctly, I would say it's actually a benefit to you.
So it could be something that you shared with donors that you were awarded a loan, but how you're sharing that is what you're saying is important.
Exactly.
Right. And David, my colleague Jamie responded to me. Someone had asked the question, what did she say to the donor who increased to $3,000? So she wrote me and she said the conversation she had with the donor was a continuation of a discussion from a couple of weeks ago. She had been stewarding him this season as a prospect. And then some of you who were on the call last week may remember me saying that we sent a letter from our CEO to a large group of our Stradivarius patron donors to 3,000 above and many of our higher level broad-based donors. So she sent him that letter and he was responding to her follow-up phone call. So the process was the letter dropped, she called him, and I presume she left a voice message for him. So he was following up, and he said that on their conversation, he appreciated the thoughtfulness of consistent attention, stewardship, and felt like this was a great time he could help and hopes to take advantage of benefits next season when he's able to come back to concerts. So again, I think it's a great example of let's not decide for someone, and oftentimes we'll be pleasantly surprised.
Absolutely.
And congratulations, Jamie. That was great work.
Yeah,
my dad.
Absolutely. Hey, one final thing I'll say about it too is particularly with organizations that are a little apprehensive or perhaps reluctant to continue to ask for money, particularly at high levels. Here's the great part about it. If your board's right and this approach is wrong, you'll make 2 or 3 calls and you'll know it right away. Now, and you can stop. So I have no anticipation that that's really what you'll run into. But if you do, this isn't like sending out, 50 letters and having a catastrophe on your hand. That's another byproduct of personal outreach, that if it needs tweaked or changed or suspended, you can do that immediately. So let's talk about institutional giving. And institutional being corporations, foundations, your sponsorships, your grantors, that sort of thing. And looking at the cultivation and stewardship components of that, you're probably getting the theme by now when we say make it personal through individual outreach. Treat these people, organizations, as partners, because they are. And they are people who you're reaching out to and talking with personally. And so the more flexibility, the more community-centric businesses that you can talk to as well. So if you can offer flexibility and reach out to local businesses who generally make their own funding decisions, that's a little bit easier right now, even if the gift amount is lower, than working with mega corporations who have really stringent processes that are maybe perhaps in disarray right now and go to 5 different cities before a decision's made. So that's one thing that we look at. We also say revise recognition opportunities and realign them with what's currently available. So if concerts are offline right now, that's okay. And if you have other programs, or if you're producing online content, that's okay. And you can then approach them and be flexible about how you thank them, how you recognize them. But the first step to doing all that is to actually create an inventory of what you expect your activities to be over the next 12 to 18 months, so that when you begin to have those conversations with either returning or prospective sponsors, you can talk in terms of what you can actually deliver in terms of stewardship and recognition. The third point of communicate frequently, be flexible, be problem solving. This is a lot like Premier Donors. Everyone's in recovery mode. Things change rapidly. Your lives are changing rapidly. Your donors' lives, your sponsors' lives, your funders' lives are changing rapidly. So this idea about how can you offer more options? How can you be prepared to think creatively? Some of these funders, their review cycles might change, their criteria might change, their budgets might change, processes might change. So I'm saying in those regard, that's the reason to stay in contact with them right now, even if you can't ask immediately because of the processes. But to stay in contact with them to see what's changing on their side and adapting to that will really put you in a much better position than if once you get the concerts prepared again and you have those dates set, that's when you set out to begin talking to sponsors and potential sponsors again. Engaging the board and musicians again in personal outreach. Again, be creative. I don't know if musicians can play at corporate headquarters when things are open back up, or small businesses, or if they can do virtual concerts that are by invitation only to sponsors and funders. I don't know if board members can make visits or calls or do group socials on Zoom, but you do. And so I'd say think about being creative in that regard to, again, stay in contact with your sponsors and your funders in a similar way that you would for individuals. The last point, and I'm surprised by this because I see a lot of the emails and postings about canceled concerts. And with the exception of very few instances, I'm not seeing the organization still thank their sponsors who were going to support that concert that was canceled. And there might be really good reasons behind it. It might be because you're going to move them into something else, or you're deciding how to move them into something else. But it doesn't really matter to me. If you're going to cancel a concert and it was sponsored, I think in the press release that you're sending out, or on your webpage that you're sending out, or whatever the communication is, continuing to thank those sponsors and recognizing them there is a huge value add. And it's probably one they weren't expecting. And it's something that you can send to them too, to see what you're doing to continue to recognize and appreciate them. It's very extroverted, it's very conspicuous in that way. And it's easy to do. So I would say as much as you can do that, continue to do it. And then on the next slide, when we talk about solicitation process, again, this is best practices amplified. If you can agree with your prospective sponsor on the approach and the focus prior to the ask, prior to generating a proposal, but if everyone agrees that whatever they're going to get is a good idea and worthy of genuine review, that again puts you miles ahead of where you would have been otherwise than if you send a proposal and then begin to negotiate. So that constant contact of talking and working through the potential details, very beneficial. I would say developing the new inventory I mentioned a moment ago. It depends on what your organization is, what you're doing, what you're able to do, what's just up over the horizon. But again, be very intentional about it and begin to create a list of things that you believe can be underwritten, even if it's not something that you normally do, even if it's operational, as long as it's outward thinking, affects the patron base, affects the community, affects education in some way. Those are things that you can really begin to be creative on. Some of what I've heard out there is a focus on all the things we can't do anymore because we're not playing. And while I understand and sympathize with it, that doesn't help you motivate and perpetuate giving, particularly from institutional level givers. So continue to drive the process, but be sensitive to the deadlines and how those things might change. Even if you can't offer everything you could offer before, be prepared with that donor to offer a couple of other things, even if you're not sure, and that's when the negotiation begins. Give them a couple of choices, make it an education and a community program, or make it for musicians and something else, and see where they begin to gravitate towards. And then you can create a proposal that's much more likely to get a yes, even in a difficult time like this. And James, I don't know if you've got any examples that you wanted to share just about adapting to sponsors and grantors as the Dallas Symphony has been moving concerts and preparing for 2021, but I thought I'd throw it out there to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll give two examples. One, we've seen web traffic and email open rates skyrocket in recent weeks. I'm sure that's the case for most of you out there. That's a great opportunity to leverage to provide greater recognition for corporate partners, however you might want to structure that, whether it's part of recognizing an existing partnership or it's leverage for establishing a new or renewed partnership. At a very specific example, we have a program called Box Lunch. It's a very sort of cheeky, cheesy play on Bach, of course, and having a boxed lunch. It's an adult education program that we do once a month, I think, on Fridays, that we're transitioning to an online format. And that's a great opportunity for us to recognize a corporate partner through that. So, and it's actually something we had been recognizing the partner who provided the lunches for all of those. Now that people will be providing their own, it gives us a different opportunity since we've transitioned that existing corporate partner to something else. So those are two very easy examples.
Great, thank you.
So we have several questions.
Okay.
So one is, if you already have the grant in hand and it was to be used this season, do you offer to give it back or convert it to an upcoming season, or how would you recommend dealing with that situation?
Yeah, it's very much the reason for having the relationship with the funder. And understand that by no means are you in a vacuum with your funder on having to deal with this. They are creating their own procedures and pathways on what to do with this, knowing that this has been a situation that was not created on anyone's ineptitude in terms of nonprofit agencies. And so they're, in most cases, willing to work with your organization to say, well, what can we do? And in some cases, so I tend to give a choice between a couple of yeses. And one of those would be, can we use this right now for something else, or just for our general operations to prepare to bring music back on stage? Or could we delay this and use it into the next season? I tend to, because of my filter is keep the money and keep it in this year. I would do everything I could to try to get them to release that money, understanding the current situation. And you might look at giving them some additional recognition, or some special, going into next season, some added or special opportunities that they didn't otherwise have, or to work with their other partners in a way that you don't normally do to add value to their situation. There are things like that you can do. I would, it's sort of like offering ticket refunds. It's not that I won't do it. It's just, it's certainly not at the top of my list.
Well, and here's a recommendation from Juneau, Alaska. Alaska Airlines is one of their major season partners. One idea that they've had is to have players perform in local airports as things begin to open up, and to provide calming music to support stressed travelers that could say it was made possible by support from Alaska Airlines. So I think that's a lovely idea as well.
Oh, sure. It's a terrific.
Yeah, sure. Love that.
Another thought is, if you have a proposal that was written before the pandemic, and or think that certainly the number of impressions and benefits could change for next season, do you make a point of sending a revised proposal to that institution now, or just wait and see what the prospective sponsor wants to do?
I would reach out to them right away. If it were me, I would, and because again, they're dealing with this unilaterally and universally, I should say. So, I mean, they're figuring it out too, and so depending on what the grant's for and how specific it is, it would probably dictate an answer from them of saying, well, here's what we suggest. So, really, what you want to do is work with them to create options, and perhaps bring some solutions to the table on your own. But really find out how they're treating things like this right now, because they're dealing with a lot of them.
Absolutely. And then the other things with sponsors is if you're asking them to convert a current sponsorship to, say, your general operating fund this year, what do you do about next year when you go back to them again to sponsor something in the future that they may think they have already sponsored, but you use their money differently?
Well, as long as they know about it and have agreed to it, and you've documented it, there shouldn't be any surprises. So again, it's all part of that depth of communication, frequency of communication. And so as long as everyone knows what's being done with the money right now in a really interesting time, I think you'll be okay. If you decide to use it for something else and don't communicate that, well, that's a different kind of conversation, probably one you don't want to have.
And if most of your major donors are sponsors who do get perks such as tickets or ads, mentions from the stage, and you're not sure when your next set of concerts will begin, how do you advise selling those sponsorships for FY21 at this time?
These are individuals?
Yes, or it could be an institution, either one.
And
how do you sell something you're not sure how you'll be able to deliver it from the benefit side?
I tell you what, I'm gonna hold on that one until we get into this next final section.
Okay.
Because it kind
so
of
let's go on then.
A little bit, but let's make sure we get that specifically as well.
Okay.
So last week, one of the things we touched on was this idea of preparing 3 organizational plans, almost operational plans, if you will. And so this isn't just for fundraising. This is one of our thoughts, and one of the best practices we've seen out there are institutions who are saying, okay, there are 3 different times we might start the season. And we have to have a plan for each one of those so that we don't start with a blank piece of paper if the first one doesn't work and we have to move to the second one. So last week, I think what we talked about was a on-time launch, a holiday launch, and maybe a February launch. And boy, do a lot of things change in a week because we've rearranged that now. So each of these plans, again, they're 3, they have different targets, and you have to take in consideration what that means for donors and sponsors and, of course, ticket buyers. But fundraising centric, particularly your sponsors, and particularly these larger donors who may sponsor and who certainly have season tickets. So in all cases, though, we're going to focus. Here, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. In all cases, we're going to focus on value. And so if you're going to message, continue, you have to keep supplying it within your means. Even if you're with a small organization, you can add value. If you can't produce art and music, you can direct your donors to other people who are doing it right now. So looking at how you can just add value as being the sort of resident arts organization that they're familiar with is fine. But in all cases, in all 3 of these plans, you can build out the value and how you'll communicate, what you'll communicate, when you'll communicate it. And then each one of those will be similar but different depending upon the launch date of your season. Of course, high leverage, high return activities are first in every case. Those will be your largest donors, your largest sponsors, your largest funders. We're going to get into some of those details. I'll go quickly so we can get to the rest of these Q&A. But if you go to the next slide, it's fundraising plan number 1. So we made plan number 1. It changed from season launch on time to now being holiday 2020 launch. Your situation may be different. These are just to show you examples. So in this case, it would be a front-loaded leadership. This is all for fundraising. Front-loaded leadership giving, sponsorship, and what we're calling heroic giving all asking in your fiscal quarter 1 and your fiscal quarter 2. Even if you're not performing, but performances are coming up, it's okay to continue to request support, and it's okay to have a plan that you share with people. This is what we're working on right now. We say also curb the high cost, low yield asking until post-election. And so that's the broad base that James was talking about. So this idea of how much direct mail do we send out, how much telefunding, you know, and again, it's not, rarely will I say you shouldn't ask someone for support, but be smart about it. And in this time where there's still uncertainty, plus there's election, there's just a lot of noise, it's very likely that your broad base, it'll be very difficult to get their attention through direct mail pieces. We do say increase your communication activity -8 weeks before the launch on this. So in this case, it would be somewhere mid-September to 1st of October that you'd unleash this sort of thing if you were having a holiday 2020 launch. And you continue to produce and share online, promote, lots of confidence, lots of value, continue to do stewardship. All those practices remain in place. So if we go to the fundraising plan number 2, which in this case now, the next slide would be a spring and summer launch in 2021, which seems like a long way away, but here we are. Again, the practice that doesn't change, we want to front load leadership, sponsorship, and multi-year and heroic asking in fiscal year Q1 and Q2. And again, to define that heroic asking, that's generally a one-time gift because of the current situation from a handful of donors, not from everybody, from a small group of your very best friends. We would get all that top level asking done early. Why? Because they know you, they love you, they trust you, and so they will be most apt, and they can be the most helpful, so they will be the most apt to be responsive in the way that you need up front. Again, curb the high cost, low yield asking until concerts resume or until you know when those concerts are going to resume. Increase communication activity -8 weeks again. So for a spring or summer launch, that depends on the month that you're launching. Back it up 8 weeks, and that's when we really begin to build the broad base communications for fundraising. And again, produce and share music. Don't ever stop doing this. Don't ever stop promoting confidence and value for your institution. Plan number 3, last plan, fall 2021 launch. So that would be for the 21-22 season. If you have to miss the entire season for whatever reasons that you likely can't control that are related to your hall, might be continued related to the pandemic, but we say plan and schedule as traditional because there'll be a whole lot of fundraising that happens during this downtime. But plan and schedule that more traditional, increase your communication activity over the summer to prepare. Likely as your communications are going to be ratcheted way up anyway because you're going to be back on stage. Front load the leadership and heroic asking again in fiscal Q1 and Q2. You might have to go through 2 rounds of that. So in the previous year when you didn't perform, and now we're into a new year, you want that front loaded again. And then what we say is be ready for mid-fiscal year changes because we don't know what's going to happen. You may have to suspend playing again. You might have to play in different venues. So lots of different variables that are tough to define with any confidence at this point. And that's it. We have so the next slide is just again, so we can field a few questions. We've got a few minutes here still with you and happy to take some of those.
So a question about a lot of the online content that's being created by orchestras. What if a large percentage of the top level donors are not online, such as Facebook or YouTube? How do you recommend that you provide these donors with that good news and let them know how you're sharing online and with the community when they may not be able to experience it themselves?
Well, James lives this in real time. I'll give the very quick answer, and the quick answer is stay in communication with them in ways that they're comfortable.
Yeah, I agree with that. For us, it's a very small group of our donors, even our higher level ones who are not engaged online, and in almost all cases they have some sort of social platform, usually Facebook. But if they truly just have no online engagement, and we do have a person like that, it's just a lot of phone calls and writing letters back and forth, and that's the best we can do with them right now.
And I know these two topics came up last week, but I think they're worth addressing again this week, particularly in reaching out to donors. What are your recommendations for creating a relief fund? Do you perceive this as being a crisis outreach or a logical offering considering the environment? Other organizations seem to have been successful with this type of campaign. May we be short-sighted by not creating this type of campaign?
James, would you like to take that one? You want me to take it?
I'll start by saying, again, first of all, I think there's a lot of detail that would have to go into giving a fully informed response that makes sense, but I wouldn't say that you're necessarily missing an opportunity unless your donor base or board are coming to the table and someone is stepping up and saying, I think we should do this. If that is the case, then I would have a number of questions about what that looks like. But I think, as we said last week, you certainly can do that successfully. And I think the key is that it's an and conversation, not an or. It's let's build this relief fund for this very important reason, and also invest in your orchestra so that when the time comes, we can continue serving the community through music.
Great. Hey, David, I've got a quick question for you. I know
Certainly.
You've got a lot of questions lined up here. Is it okay for anybody who wants to stay on? Can we go over a few minutes?
Sure, we can go a few minutes. It's okay with the two of you.
Yeah, it's perfect. James, are you okay? Because I know we've got a lot of questions and I want to be sure we can answer those.
Yeah, that works for me.
Okay.
Okay. I know this was brought up last week as well, particularly about campaigns. Maybe you could expand on your thoughts about the best time to begin a significant endowment or maybe an educational campaign. Should you wait till the fall to start a silent phase? Should the pandemic be completely over before beginning a silent phase? Agreed that we don't want to do anything public during the pandemic, but what about beginning the quiet phase? Any suggestions?
I'll just give, this is Bob, I'll just give, my reaction is I would be very cautious about launching an endowment campaign under the current conditions for a lot of reasons, not the least of which it doesn't do you the most good as an orchestra right now. Most of you are not, you're already missing one of the legs of the three stools and ticket sales. And so to focus your major donors who you might need to have make heroic gifts of cash for operational purposes, having them consider a multi-year large cash gift might distract from that. Again, not in every case, and so it's really hard to talk about in generalities here. You could potentially roll it out if you had, if there was a planned giving component and you were going to talk about planned gifts. But again, during the course of the pandemic, talking to donors, and I'm not being funny when I say this, talking to donors about a pandemic and a matching, or I'm sorry, and a legacy gift all in the same breath could feel be a very difficult conversation. I'll put it that way.
And again, lots of people are concerned about knowing when things will open up again, when concerts will begin, and the idea of waves of the pandemic coming back in the fall potentially. Is there any way that, since this isn't predictable over the next several months, how does that change the messaging that you're doing with your donors and your solicitation?
I'll say for us, the uncertainty aspect of it hasn't really impacted that greatly. Our general messaging is, and Bob said this earlier, we want to be as prepared as possible when the time comes for us to be able to continue providing music and music education and serving our community in all the ways that we were. and it's important for us to be as prepared for that as possible. So we don't really address, if we can go back by this date, then here's our needs. If we can go back by this date, here's our needs. We keep it much more broad for the vast majority of our conversations.
Yeah, and sort of reflective of what I said last week too was keep the conversation at a high enough altitude that you can talk about things that won't likely change day after tomorrow. It's good to inform donors, but we don't want to confuse them, and we don't want it to look like we can't stay the course on any particular thing. So I would just say, as you're thinking about that, create an optimistic, value-based, outward-looking message that has some levels of consistency to it.
And speaking of types of campaigns, there's certainly potentially a record number of people revising wills and trusts right now. And so how do we think about planned giving in this moment in time, and make sure that any written materials, email or mail, include any legacy or planned giving?
I think you can do that. Again, I caution a little bit about being too aggressive about it, particularly now. But soft marketing on this, I think, is fine to include it on gift receipts and on the website and things, just for those people who are, and if you, particularly on your board, have a resource for people who will help generate that sort of either will revision or codicil that goes along with it, I think that's a nice service as well, and it helps promote one of your board members if he or she is interested in doing that sort of thing and offering it as a service right now. So there's some soft ways that you can do it without connecting it too much to what's going on out in the world today.
I'll add to that. I just happened to have a conversation with a colleague of mine at the Dallas Symphony, Tony Miller, who manages all of our planned giving programs. So we use an outside agency for marketing our planned giving programs. And again, I recognize many on this call may not have the resource for that, but what I'm getting to is one of the things we do in that's very common is we feature donor stories, people who have let us know that, they've included provisions for the DSO in their estate plan. And we like to find out about their symphony story. So just like earlier when I said one thing you can do to engage board members is have a 45-minute, hour-long conversation and just have them tell you their story with the symphony, especially for anybody who's been involved for a couple of decades or more, which you probably have quite a few in many cases. So the way we're couching that with them is, hey, we want to collect these stories of our longtime patrons and supporters from an archival perspective. And we may come back to you in the future and ask you if we could feature some or all of your story in one of our planned giving newsletters. So it's a very indirect way of sort of causing them to think about it. And in the meantime, it gives us one more way to stay connected with our donors, learn about them, engage them in a meaningful way. So we're going to start investing time in doing that across all of our giving segments.
Great, James. Then who is the agency that you use for your outside consulting?
We use Stelter.
Stelter, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think a sort of final wrap-up question, because again, this is on a lot of people's minds, is whether it's advertisers and selling ads and program books or membership programs that provide defined benefits. Any advice on what to say to people when you really have no ability to control or predict when those ads may happen, when those benefits may be able to be redeemed or provided as you're still going out and communicating to those individuals?
Sure. This is Bob. I'll take that. And so the idea of, again, the parts that you can't control, I would say look at what you can control. You can control the deliverables themselves. You just don't know when. And so you don't know if it's going to be November or March. And so that's what makes it difficult. But what you can do are things that say, if you say yes now, we'll give you an upgrade on the advertisement, or we'll have a special sponsors only event after our first concert, second concert back on stage, whatever makes sense for their schedules. You can then also say, as the season begins to open up and we have a solid concert schedule, you'll have first right of refusal on XYZ, and that might be a performance, that might be a weekend, that might be a benefit. So again, think creatively about it. Again, kind of think about what you can do, what you can deliver, and then emphasize that.
I would also add, recognizing this is not going to work in all cases, and I think it's more effective with renewing support rather than prospective support. I would say don't be afraid to just make the philanthropic case as well. You know, once you've exhausted the list of options in terms of how you could provide recognition and benefits, realizing it's going to fall short of what you could do when we're normally in concerts, I would absolutely encourage you to just make the philanthropic case. And I think many corporations, to the best of their ability, will respond positively to that, especially if they've been a partner for a number of years.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, James. And I know, Bob, you have a special offer for our member orchestras.
We do. Thanks for that. I mean, one of the things that we put out is our virtual fundraising coach program at a reduced rate, really 3 months for the price of 2, and even the 2 months we've reduced down from what our normal cost is on it. And we're given a money back promise because we know this is a time where spending money is really scrutinized at a much higher degree. What we want to do is continue to help as much as we can. And so we've got 20 spots open on this. I think we're down to, 12 maybe at this point, still available to work with organizations over the next 3 months so that you can really maximize your fundraising program. Right now, you've got enough to think about as orchestras. And you can't afford to make mistakes on fundraising. You're moving really briskly. This has to be efficient and has to be effective. So that's why we're offering this to be helpful and to engage with you and to be able to partner with you. If there's a way we can help, please reach out to us. We're happy to do it.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And I want to thank Bob and James for all their work last week and this week. And I want to sort of leave you with sort of my 2 summaries of what I heard from them about, this is the time to be raising money. If you don't ask, you won't get. And other people are going to be asking your donors for their money. And so you should be getting it yourself. And you never know when that annual fund donor will double their debt because they recognize the dire situation many orchestras and organizations are in. So do ask. And the second one is be creative. And it's wonderful to hear a lot of the innovation that orchestras are doing. So for example, the Stanford Symphony musicians have made 600 calls to all donors and subscribers. And so that's a cultivation stewardship that would have never been potentially thought of, but has great potential down the road to strengthen that orchestra in the future. Or the El Paso Symphony has asked their principal musicians to create videos of themselves playing a piece. They're posting one video weekly on their Facebook page, and then prior to posting the video, the chair sponsors are approached to let them know that their names will be credited on the videos and that they're using them in a way to ask for them to renew that chair sponsor's commitment for the next season. And so again, it's a time that can feel very stressful, but in any panic, there can be, again, these really innovative and creative solutions to help us through this time. And we're excited to be taking our national conference online. And so I hope all of you have already registered for free for our member orchestras at leagueconference.org. And we'll be beginning in just a week and a half almost. And we would look forward to seeing you there to continue hearing your stories, providing you creative solutions to problems, and having great experts like James and Bob and share what is happening in the field to move us through this time, and also to hear from you as well. We also have our resources pages on our league's website, and we also have these webinars as well. And again, all these that we've done in April are on demand on our website. And next Wednesday, our webinar will be an orientation to the conference. This is a whole new world for all of us, both as the league staff and our wonderful presenters and speakers, as well as you as the audience attendees and delegates. So if you would like to get a preview of the conference and the technology platform that we'll be using, we would look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. So again, I want to thank Bob and James for their time these 2 weeks. And again, whatever we can do at the league to be of assistance to you, don't hesitate to be in touch with us. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of the week.